Well, hello, welcome back. We are reading this week through the book of Galatians, and today we're reading chapter 1, verses 11 through to 24. You probably know the backdrop to this letter, at least in part, I'm sure. But the Apostle Paul is writing to the church in Galatia. He's writing to them because they had become confused about the gospel. Evidently, some false teachers had infiltrated their ranks and began firstly to question the authenticity of Paul as an apostle, but it also began to twist the message that Paul proclaimed. And so Paul writes this letter, one, to defend his authenticity as a gospel of Jesus, but also to reaffirm them of the message that he proclaimed. This is how he writes in verse 11. I want you to know, brothers, that the gospel that was preached by me is not man's gospel, but I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. Paul says, listen, the message that you heard from me wasn't something that I made up. It wasn't something that I'd heard from someone else and just repeated to you. The message that I proclaimed to you was given to me directly by Jesus Christ. In other words, Paul says the gospel is not a message from earth, but it's a message from heaven. You know, when we reflect on the message of the gospel, I think this does actually make sense. Think about the story, right? The gospel is the message that God has redeemed and restored creation from the power of evil, sin, and death. Now, if I was going to write that story of a God rescuing the whole earth from evil, I don't think I would choose to write it by saying that a young Jewish man was tortured and executed on a Roman cross, rose again, and ascended back to heaven. I don't think that's the way I would write that story, because I don't actually think it's particularly believable, right? If I was writing a story about God rescuing the whole earth, I would choose to do it a very different way than that. And so would you, and so would every other human being. See, if humans were writing this story, then they wouldn't write it in this way. And that's exactly Paul's point. He's saying, listen, this isn't a human story. The gospel is not a message that was made up in the mind of a man. The gospel is a message that came directly from heaven. Elsewhere in the Bible, in 1 Corinthians 1, Paul says the message of the gospel is foolishness, right? And it is, when you think about it from a purely human perspective. The message of the gospel doesn't make sense. It's ridiculous, it's bizarre, it's scandalous, it's foolish. And it's foolishness that I think should help us to be convinced of its truthfulness. Why else would this message come to us if it didn't come from heaven? There's no way a human would have written this message. It's a message from heaven, and that's Paul's point in these few verses today. This gospel is from heaven, not from man. So just today, reflect on the foolishness of the gospel, and let the foolishness of the message convince you of its truthfulness. Bless you. See you tomorrow.